to do a little informal interactive activity. There's a question here on the board. What concerns you about creating a classroom and or responding to microaggressions in the classroom? You all have Post-it notes. If you can please take your Post-it note and respond to the question, and you can put the Post-it note with your response on either board.
All right. We want to once again thank you all for coming and definitely welcome you for coming to our session, creating a inclusive classroom, moving beyond microaggressions. I'm sorry, creating a classroom here. But what we want to do, we're going to start off by definitely introducing ourselves as we are members of the CDI team, and I will start off. So my name is Shannon Smith, and I'm the Assistant Director for Student Success and Transition, programs he and his, within the Center for Diversity and Inclusion.
I am Robin Adams, Director of Educational Program and Training. It's nice to see a lot of familiar faces. Hi, Mike.
Hi everyone, so Consuelo Graham, Director of Multicultural Student Support in the Center for Diversity and Inclusion, Robin's co-director.
Hi everybody, my name is Michelle Strange. I'm the Coordinator for Dialogue and Diversity Programs, and my pronouns are she, her, hers.
Hi y'all, my name is Anna Morrison. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I'm the coordinator for LGBTQ student support and diversity programs in the Center for Diversity and Inclusion. So you heard a couple of us here today share our pronouns. We wanted to just quickly explain why we do that as a practice in CDI. So in thinking about the identities of the people that we meet, we might not automatically know what someone's gender is because we haven't talked to them and they haven't told us what their gender is. So for many people, being able to share their pronouns and have folks affirm their identities by using those pronouns is an important part of how in CDI we're trying to create a culture of care.
Thanks so much. So want to talk a little bit just about why did we decide to do this workshop? So as you can imagine in CDI, oftentimes we try to create as much of a safe space as possible for students. So that also means that sometimes our students are coming to us with challenges they've experienced in the classroom, trying to figure out how they process it, how they can navigate, how they may file a bias report, or how they reach out to the professor, how they can talk to somebody. Basically, how do they navigate this experience that they've had and not let it be a hindrance to their educational experience? So part of what we wanted to do today was create this environment to be able to have a conversation, because we just come from the belief that nobody wants to do harm in their classroom, but sometimes the actions or inaction will create harm that's unintended. So it's not necessarily about our intention, it's always about our impact. So we thought that this would be a really good opportunity to have some discussion about that and leave everybody with some tools that you can utilize in this. By a quick show of hands, how many of you have already seen at some point, either recently through the provost or potentially through one of the sessions earlier today, the video that the Black Print did about microaggressions and experiences in the classroom? Perfect. We had a feeling, gut feeling, that a lot of folks in this particular session would have already seen that, so we're gonna move on from that. We're not gonna do that. But what I do wanna share a little bit about is some of the data we have at AU about our climate and what students are experiencing. So a couple of, not really highlights, but important things to know about our student experience here is that broadly at AU, most students have positive experiences. But as we drill down by race and ethnicity and other types of identities and identifiers, we know that students have different experiences depending upon how they're navigating. So a couple of key things that I think are important for this session is to understand how people experience the classroom. So when asked the question, faculty manage classrooms to ensure respectful treatment of all perspectives. Broadly, those at AU said 77%. There's still room to do there when we think about the overall AU community. When we drill down by race and ethnicity, we start to see some concerns. So Black or African American students responded to that question at about 67%. So that's a 10% lower experience broadly from those who have been interviewed for these questions. We see similar dips when we look at our Latinx students and our API students across the campus. We start to talk about my courses present diverse perspectives where appropriate. Broadly across AU is about 61%. We again see dips when we look at our Black students, our Latinx students, and our API students. So we know that in the classroom experience, they're experiencing very differently than their white counterparts across the classroom. And again, everybody's experience is going to be different. So does this mean all Black students are having poor experiences in class? No. Does it mean all of our API students, or for that matter, that all of our white students are experiencing the class in a positive light? No. There's no broad generalizations we can make, but what we can see across some of this data is that people aren't experiencing probably in the ways that faculty and instructors are intending for it to come across. So that's where we know that there is some work that really needs to be done.
Thank you for setting up the need for us. So we want to sort of do some vision setting with everyone. So we're going to ask about 1 minute. We'll give some time for everyone to think. What is one word that is your sort of goal or vision word for how you would like your classroom of care to look like?
You can just shout these out.
Reading classroom of care. What's one word to describe it? Say it again.
Humanizing.
Humanizing. And we're going to throw these up on
Listening.
listening.
Validating.
Validating. Perfect.
I like that word somebody was using this morning, brave. Brave space.
Fantastic. Keep shouting them out. Equity. Wonderful.
Welcoming.
Welcoming.
Supportive.
Supportive.
Intentional.
Intentional. Fabulous. Responsive. Great. Being seen. Fabulous.
Caring.
Caring.
Reciprocal.
Reciprocal. Great.
Joyous.
Joyous. Fabulous. That's the goal, right? That's why we're here. Anyone else? Goal.
Compassionate.
Compassionate. Fabulous. Thoughtful. Wonderful.
Trusting.
Trusting. I'm really feeling the intentionality of these words.
Authentic.
Authentic. Great. I think these are all a lofty and doable goal.
So, oh, thank you. I always forget to use this mic. Then the New Yorker comes out of me, and I start wanting to do Eric B. and Rakim. So forgive me. And for those of you who don't know the reference, see me later. I'll be happy to give you a whole earful of my 80s and 90s hip hop days in New York when I used to spin on my back on cardboards. Yeah. Nah. Okay, let me stop. I'm back. Okay. So we want to purpose ourselves in where we want to go. Why even this thing called a caring classroom? And aren't they caring already? Like you showed up, you signed a contract, AU paid you to be here. Wasn't that it enough? Nah. So we want to talk about even before we even talk about some of these strategies, like what needs to happen even before we get to this place in the classroom where we're demonstrating it. Ounce of prevention, pound of cure. So I want to hear by show some popcorn. What do people do? Because we know there's lots of knowledge in this room. What do people do that demonstrates that you care about the students that you will teach? That is that kind of where you invest that time, where you say like, I'm doing this because I love them. I swear to God, if I didn't love them, I wouldn't be, up at this time, this morning, this weekend, this period, doing this.
I
I enjoy starting every class with about a minute or two of people sharing good news in their life. And I listen and I remember and I can usually follow up the next class to check in on what it is that they have talked about.
Good news in their life, what's the word, right? I love that. What else?
It's required, but
Office hours, that required thing that they make us put on the syllabi, okay? And one of the things about CDI is we don't police conversations. We engage conversations, so please pop. If you feel like popping, pop.
Being vulnerable, just bringing my full self, who I am as a person, not a professor.
Right. Bringing your full self, your authentic self to the classroom. It shows students that you are a real person.
I have to talk to a partner for a minute, and I have to talk with them in that vein, something they're excited about. Say, how are you feeling? Everyone's tired, exhausted, stressed. So that's a negative kind of, environment. So say, just share something you're excited with each other.
So I want to push us, thank you for that. So you're sharing yourself, you're sharing or at least taking out the steam, especially for introverts who show up in a classroom or a lot of our students are experiencing anxiety, even just showing up in a classroom sometimes is the biggest thing they would do for the day, right? And we won't know that. So the fact that there's somebody that they can talk to in a one-on-one before we engage in this large group orchestration. So I want to push us a little around the before the classroom, the before that shows, that demonstrates the care.
Before that first day.
I'm wondering if it would make sense, it's not an interaction with the students, but in syllabus design, making sure I have room for their input for parts of the classes, and also something I keep working on, because this is my interest, is what's the diversity in the readings and the authorships that I have?
All right. Yes.
Like, what are we reading?
Yeah. And I think we got a student on here saying, that is it. That is the answer. Now we can move on. You would not believe that is it. When we hear from students, the biggest frustration often is the structure of the class that did not include the very folks who are to take in the knowledge. The lack of diversity in viewpoints and perspectives. And so we say a caring classroom starts with the pre-work. It starts with the checking our own biases and really examining who we are as instructors before we even step in front of the classroom. And so how many of you have done your work around the implicit bias test and have checked in around some of that, right? How many of you have engaged in a relationship, a partnership? Like I have a professional partnership with some folks in this room as thought partners, my wonderful team in CDIs, but also other mentors and other folks who I soundboard with. I'm about to do this thing. Does this sound like I've lost my mind again? Or does this sound like I'm on the right track? Somebody who's not my choir. Beverly Tatum says that the choir needs rehearsal as well as oftentimes when we speak to the choir, even the choir needs rehearsal. So sometimes I talk to my colleagues for that rehearsal and that tuning, but sometimes I talk to folks who have no idea what my discipline is, and they will tell me I'm crazy. Ron, that makes no sense. So that kind of relationship, I think the group earlier, in one of the sessions earlier, talked about that community of practice. So how many of you are engaging in that kind of broader sense of community practice, right? Because that's another way, because that also is a soundboard. One of the things the students tell us is that often, sometimes, in absence of having that, faculty are doing that with students. We're not doing that. They don't show up to be our soundboard. What they show up to is for that sense of care that we figured it out and we're not practicing on them, right? So one of the things we want to talk about is that pre-work. One of the other ways that we know are effective in terms of utilizing that pre-work are surveys and office visits that deepen learning. How many of you have mandatory office visits for students? Like when you make them talk to you, right? Like some students will hate it, but when you sit down and if that conversation is meaningful for them, that you actually ask them about themselves, that you don't talk about the discipline, but you're like, how are you? How is AU going for you? How are you sleeping? How are you eating? Those basic Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You'd be surprised how students kind of open up to you because it actually signals for them, I think this other person cares about me. They just asked me how am I doing, and they stopped and they listened and they looked me in the eye and they actually have an engagement with me. Surveys, one of the things that these kind of pre-surveys where you're, where you're asking your students about what pronouns do they use, what are things that concerns them, what are their fears about this course, what are their joys recently, what are they celebrating, all of those things in a pre-survey, utilizing our university systems, as well as with that. So whether we do it on Blackboard or whether we're doing it in some form that's accessible to all students. Content warning on things that are sensitive materials. There's nothing worse than sitting in a room and you don't know what is about to hit you and something just happened to your life and you're just like, why? And for the rest of the day you're affected. Whether that's something related to any form of violence or just something that you might not even thought was a trigger warning. So we also say that we have to be real thoughtful and sensitive about that, as well as how that we have alternate assignments in those moments. That we say to them, this thing is about to happen. If you don't want to watch this video, you can do this instead. You can actually, take on this assignment, go to the library, whatever the case may be. That also adds value, and they're not opting out of class, but they're also, there's an alternative way for them to engage. Adding a descriptor around pronouns, and we have some language that we can make available to you in your syllabus around pronouns, and that encourages students to be able to speak to you directly around that. And that's front and center and centers your value around that aspect of inclusion. Allowing multiple modes of participation. As an introvert, believe it or not, I really am. You don't want to see me outside of this. I've learned to be extroverted in my role, but as an introvert, there's nothing worse than only one way that participation looks like. And if you ask me to tell you something 30 seconds after you've said it, I feel like I'm dying on the inside. I love reflection and journaling and all those lovely things. And so finding ways to make sure in the course of all that, built into your syllabi, you've given them that opportunity. And at the end of the day, decolonizing your syllabus, really asking yourself, why do I have this thing in there? Like, why is this really necessary for the learning that I want students to have? And to really think thoughtfully about all of this prior to actually going into the classroom with students. One of my, Amanda Taylor, I'm about to call you out. Amanda Taylor, here's the call out. Amanda and I were having this wonderful conversation. I teach in the AUX program for transparency. And I remember we were sitting there as we were waiting to engage in a restorative justice circle with some students, and we were talking about syllabus, and she was like, yeah, I let my students make the syllabus. And I said, what? They let you do that? And so we had this wonderful conversation around the fact that students could create that for themselves, and that's how we equalize power, and that's how we actually demonstrate practices of anti-racism. So I haven't tried it yet, Amanda. You can tell the group about how you do that.
Talk more about that
Later on. But I think it's a very tangible example about something that this institution says that we must do a certain way that you could do differently. So any questions about pre-work or anything that you would toss up on the slide that we have not included in CDI that jumps front of mind for you? Awesome. So the next, yeah, Shannon.
All right, so Robin did an amazing job of explaining how you can even set up that space to become a classroom of care. And I'm sure one of the thoughts that we may not have really thought of is, at the end of the day, why is it even important? Why is it important to have this classroom of care? Why should we take these extra steps? And some of those things, we even get into, when we think of it, do we believe that someone is more apt to bring their best self to class, the best knowledge, all of those things, when they're in a space where they feel uncomfortable, where they feel if I say the wrong word, I could be counseled, I could be kicked out of class, I could get a failing grade. And I'm pretty sure we know the answer to that. If you feel uncomfortable, you're not able to bring your best self. And even when we get into that, I mean, we think of retention and all of these different things. I mean, it could be one, retention of your classroom. It could literally be, okay, I don't feel comfortable here, so I'm gonna leave this class, I'm gonna drop this class or whatnot. But then we even get into the larger scale, if that sort of compounds itself and the student says, I don't feel safe in this class, I don't feel safe in this class, this environment, this doesn't feel like it welcomes me and cares for me. Then we're looking at retention of the university, we're losing students. So even at its simplest, when we get to that, we think of retention and just overall, just the fact that we care for the students. So the question?
I have a quick question. A couple of years ago, I remember being at a session where Fanta talked about the difference between our promise to students is to have them feel safe, but not necessarily always comfortable. So Shannon, you're kind of using those two terms interchangeably. And I want to drill deeper to see, is that now an idea that has gone its way after 2 years or more? Or are we still associating academic and intellectual challenge with a kind of, oh, I'm not comfortable talking about this, but I trust the professor to make it safe for all points to be heard and to mediate in a way? Or are we now always about comfort? Because I think there is a difference, but I'm not sure in the pedagogy in your office how we're supposed to think about that.
I think the comments from Fonza still stand, absolutely. That our goal is to set up, and you're totally hitting on our second bullet point here, is that really the job in the classroom is to create boundaries and to have something that looks like learning agreements from day one. These are the boundaries of our conversations, and I'm giving you the tools to then have those difficult conversations in a way where we already agreed as a community that we're going to respect each other's identities and that we can be held to this standard when we're having those conversations.
And I think the nuance also is there's a difference between,
Thank you, Anna. There's a difference between we set you up to have these kinds of conversation, and then when students take that setup to use derogatory language or to fling hate or hurtful behaviors at other students under that guide. And it's a very thin and very fine line. And some students who are seeking to do it, they do it oh so well. You know, and that's when I sometimes feel like, as faculty, we feel like we're on a slippery slope. But I think in those moments, it's for us to, safety means that we call what we just saw. That is not about I should be able to express myself freely. It is about you're causing harm. So we have to address the harm when it happens in classrooms.
Does that help?
It does. I've had students come in and describe a situation that I don't see as harmful, but I'm respecting their right to feel that it was harmful to them. And so that's also a line too, to say you've got to practice your ability to be okay in those situations, even as there won't always be people to help you and to mediate and facilitate. But they're still learning, they're still new to these conversations, and we need to provide that extra protection, I think, from that hurt and harm. So.
And within that, I sort of see a certain level of empathy, as you mentioned, sort of that empathy of maybe I can't quite relate to this, but I can understand that how this made you feel.
Here's an example, Shannon. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Right. So we're reading, say, this is a couple years ago, the book Zaitun about Hurricane Katrina. And a Muslim student came to me afterwards and said, I felt profoundly attacked in that discussion. And I'd given trigger warnings, and the protagonist, Zaitun, was badly mistreated. I said, did you see everyone's outrage that he was treated the way he was? I just felt, so that's where it gets hard, is that I didn't see that as a harmful situation, but I'm trying to respect the student definitely did. Those are such, not all about me, guys, sorry, but these are some of the things I wrestle with. Yeah, should I not have that book on my syllabus? Can we not discuss it?
so I wouldn't say that. What I would say is say more about that. I would shore my students up, because I've had these moments this is not about predicting, you know, really about every aspect of where a student will find harm. But what I want to do is embolden them to put their voice in the room and say why that felt harmful for them. Because in that moment, it empowers them. It gives them that kind of power to say, when something happens to me, I'm able to use my voice in support of myself, Audrey Lord. So, and I think that's the difference. It's not about protecting them because they have to go out to the world, but I do think it is about emboldening them in a way that they feel empowered to own their voice amongst their peers. And that someone might say, well, I didn't see it that way. But now we have a wider viewpoint around like what hurt feels like. You know, and it's not about is my hurt right or wrong. It really is about when I am hurt, this community is the kind of place where I can say I'm hurt for these reasons. Does that make sense to you?
And she was a freshman, and to see her grow and just graduate. Yeah, so it's maturity and it's security and
And
development.
voice, because I think a lot of times here at a predominantly white institution, especially for students who are in minoritized identities, you know, they feel silenced often so much. So a community of care is also really giving them voice and really emboldening them in that power.
And I can't say enough about how doing learning agreements at the beginning of the class and having that up even every class for someone to say, okay, I know that stories stay and lessons leave, so when I share this story about myself, everyone in this community has agreed that our community norm is to do that, and that I'm comfortable sharing this story. Please. Yeah, I think we've hit on the first.
Okay, great, perfect. And also in going with that, we just have to be cognizant and know that no matter how comfortable or safe or whatever the word we may want to use, how caring we set up our classroom, we have to be aware that there are identity and power. There are definitely sometimes imbalances of identity and power. At the end of the day, know that if we're a professor in the class, there is sort of that power imbalance. Like, we know, hey, student, I care about you, you're welcome, but we know there's still that thing of, at the end of the day, I am the supporting figure in the class. And also know that sometimes there are those power imbalances that may exist among students themselves, whether it's because their student is in X organization or maybe a social class, social status, whatever it might be. So just being aware of that and being able to sort of navigate and nuance that. And also just making sure that we're able to avoid assumptions and biases that exist, while also making space for all students to thrive. So one of the things that we notice is when it comes to identity, we have to keep in mind that sometimes the identity that we may assume is most salient to a student may not be the identity that is the most salient to me. This is just a random idea or example, but take for example, maybe if we have a student that uses a wheelchair. In our head, I thought maybe, okay, you're viewing everything sort of from this lane, and you're constantly thinking about how can I navigate through this. Do I feel accepted in this and that? And to that student, the most important thing to them could be, hey, I'm a chemistry major. Like, this is the most important thing to me right now. Even though this is the identity that you see, the most important identity to me is the fact that I'm a chemistry major and this is what I care about. I want to be a scientist, this and that. So we have to realize that, and also by making sure that we sort of check our biases, because once again, based upon maybe someone's demographics or background, the assumption could be, you're a student, we've had these discussions, I know you come from this background, maybe a first generation college student, anything like that. And so maybe as a professor, sort of my assumption is, I know it's hard here for you, you're struggling, how can we get you through this, just get you to the finish line? And without knowing, this could be a student that's actually thriving. I just use sometimes the example of when I went to my university, I really did not know I was a lower income student until it was basically told to me and I saw all the other students' cars in the parking lot, right? So that sort of, to an extent, that sort of gave me this sort of feeling of a deficit where I hadn't really felt it. Like I was the same person I had always been, but until that identity was sort of placed upon me by looking at some of the others, that's when it sort of hit me. And so with that being said, we just have to keep in mind of maybe those identities or those certain expectations, especially their lower expectations that we put on other students as we set up this classroom here.
So we want to talk a little bit about tools and then give you a chance to engage with some of the tools I always forget this mic. To talk a little bit about some tools and then do some engagement. So in general, this is not an exhaustive list, but this is always front of mind for us in CDI as we think about what tools that we engage as a team, as well as with our students, and what we would highly suggest for faculty and staff as well. Some of these are familiar to some of you who are in this room who utilize some of this. And they seem very simple, but in those moments when the classroom has erupted, or those moments, I think of the heated moment. I had a heated conversation with my 15-year-old. And I was sitting there going, I statements, Robin, I statements, I statements. He was like, you don't understand my struggle. I'm like, I don't understand your struggle. I statements, Robin, I statements. And so in those moments is to really, just kind of bring this front of mind for you. Super quickly, I will not go over all of them because we are all intelligent reading people in this room. But the I statements bring forward really the acknowledging of your positionality. Shannon and Anna mentioned that a little earlier. Thinking about what's going to happen when there's a fracture in your class. What is your restoration process? Because if you haven't thought about it and when it happens, then students will make it up for themselves, and that restoration will look like Twitter or any number of social media, because they take it real fast and they take it quick to social media for some resolution. If you don't give them a process, they will give you one, and that's when we're like, said professor, sucks. I mean, I'm just real talk. That's just what they're going to say. And so we want to make sure that you've thought thoughtfully about that. And sometimes it's silent. Sometimes it's like, everybody stop. Everybody just stop talking for a moment. And sometimes that moment is for them, but sometimes it's for you while you figure out what's going to be next and where we go. And that we make sure that we really understand what the issue is that's happening. Because the presenting issue a lot of times is not the issue. Like the snatching of power and the conversation is this person did this thing. And so, but what's really happening is a power struggle between students, and you want to make sure that you name what is going on for them. So that's one aspect. The other tool we want to offer today as well is what we call the critical moments approach. And the first, and I'm sorry, this print is super tiny, so I'm going to come over here for a second. What we think about a lot in CDI is when things first happen, whether it's in a classroom or it's on campus, sometimes it's, it's the big moments, is that it's critical for us, first of all, to stop and take a moment and take in what is just happening, what's at play, what's happening for us, a little bit about what I mentioned around that pause, that we need to take a pause and really assess what's happening, and not simply from the moment here, but institutionally what has happened that brought this into the classroom, or what have we done or failed to do as an institution. All those things play out for students. Oftentimes for our students, it's both the moment, but it's cumulative. They think back to all the other hurts that have happened. So once that has happened and you really, are asking some of these clarifying questions and understanding, it's really to move to two, is there has to be an action. Like there has to be an action, and that action should be one that looks like support for all parties involved, not just for the ones who are feeling the hurt in the moment, because that's the other side of things. We often will have students say to us that, everybody flocks to the person who feels like they've been harmed, but what about me who has a perspective as well, and how do I get heard? And students who are not heard, they will make it so you hear them. So once you have figured out a little bit about what this initial action needs to be, it's not the end all to be all, but it's the initial action that demonstrates and signals for them that you're present with them. You understand what has happened.
And then 3, it might mean there's a whole lot of things that need to go on around support, resources, talking to other colleagues, contacting CDI, not all of you, but some of you. And any other resource that you might need to support what's happening in your classroom. And then the follow-up, and to really be transparent about this process with students. The more transparency and authenticity that we can bring into the classroom when these moments happen, it signals to the students that we are not just, we don't just see them as just a number or just a chair, but we see that the folks in the room are the folks in the room, and there's a real issue present that needs to be dealt with. So, to that, we are going to jump into some scenarios.
All right, so Anna is going to pass out some scenarios for each group of people. Can you go back to the toolbox?
Yes.
So, as Anna's passing that around, think through the scene and how you might respond. Think about community restoration, your own positionality, some concerns that you've listed, and how you might move forward.
So we're going to ask you to, besides the toolbox and utilizing critical moments, that you keep that front of mind. So it's not just also what you generally do, but taking on some new skills as well in this moment. Because that's the other piece. Sometimes we default to what feels comfortable to us as faculty and staff, and then there's a missed opportunity to do it a little differently.
So take about 5 minutes, and then we're going to have each scene talk through the group.
I'm Angela. Thanks.
Yeah, well, that's another thing that I've always
having conversations, not as cut and dry, it's like, oh, we do it every Thursday, to be like, go around to everyone's home and everyone's talk. But, right, maybe someone's like, I don't know myself. Yeah. But I don't want, you know, or I don't want to know it, or maybe I'm like, I think I know what it is, but I'm not like, everyone. And I'm like, that. Oh, yeah. It's best practice. They don't want to take
My understanding of what the student benefits is whatever what are your pronouns?
But I think that
My understanding is
and then the same.
they would say to
I apologize. It's always like I'm getting here. And I still think it's not.
Take a couple minutes to think through before we get to the large group.
Which program is it? Only speak next to all the watches
I can also see it with the conscious things like doesn't want to disclose this is that they might have a space where they don't. And I think that we're close that option for people. We're trying to kind of say, oh, this is safe. So it's like, actually, it may not be. And I feel like that's a part of the whole thing. It's become so open now to be like, every time someone's not so like thoughtful about when we actually best practice might be to, I don't know, how can we avoid even talking about it? I think one way to get around it is like, if we learn each other's names and stuff, why can't we do that? We didn't even like have a conversation at all, right? Now someone's like, their name, it's like much more free. Probably something you wouldn't find in the classroom, but we can go from there. But I think you know, we're talking about community and all this, like, I know it's kind of more difficult to learn a concept. I would try to class, just because then it's like, you know, you'd be like, hey, so tell me your name, or remind us all of your name, and then say what you need to say. Don't say like basic, and again, the practice should be, I don't expect them to have to learn each other's names, and be like, I'm sorry, can you say your name again? Like, John said, whatever, you know, it's like, well, really, when do we call some pronouns? I mean, how often do we have pronouns go down to the pronouns? So it's like a really, I appreciate you saying it. It's great, really fair, like, fair. I don't know, I kind of like, I don't want to mention that we had a meeting here.
Take a moment to wrap up your thoughts, whoever's speaking. All right, everybody. All right, everybody. I'm going to ask you to share some of these thoughts with the group, and there's more groups than scenes, so you'll get to hear different perspectives. But first, I want to say a few words going back to the beginning with some of the concerns that y'all listed about creating a classroom culture of care and or responding to microaggressions in the classroom. So I saw a lot of focus here on the idea of doing it wrong, or trying to do it right. I saw a lot of concerns about the conversations, like what happens when something pops off in the classroom? Am I gonna be able to respond effectively? And what even is effective, an effective way to respond, or inclusion, or calling in versus calling out, things like that. To summarize, what I really saw on the sheet, but it wasn't written, is how do I prevent these issues from happening? Which is an incredible superpower that I don't know how to give you. How do I prevent that? But rather than focusing on prevention, I want us to draw our attention to restoration. And I think that question about prevention reminds me of the conversation we were having over here about, like, you know, this student had this problem with something that we were reading and I just totally missed it. And I don't want to say the student is right or wrong, but what do I do with that? And one of the tools that we drew back to was about a classroom culture of care is about being power and identity conscious. So maybe if you do miss it, you can then start to think, okay, well, how did I miss it? Is it something about my identities and where I'm coming from? Is it something about the classroom dynamic and the people in the room that I need to think through that I didn't think through before? But now that we're here, what things can I think about to move forward? And how do I do that? And to me, that really brings about the difference between a safe space versus a brave one, where safety implies comfort and everybody's feeling good. But bravery requires taking risks, speaking truth to power, naming these dynamics, and I think that's really important. And I think that's especially important in the restoration process. So a lot of your scenes are about things that have already happened. So it's not about how do you prevent that thing from happening, because it happened and it probably will, and all of these scenes have happened, so we're drawing from experiences from you all. So focus on that as you think through the tools and what you want to do moving forward, as well as the very real concerns that you had on the board that you listed, because we really want to make this part practical based on what things you would actually do and what concerns you have in these scenarios. So for the first one, it's the N-word scenario. Which groups had that scenario? All right, over here. Can someone read the scenario and then talk about what they think about what they would do moving forward? And we'll give about 5 minutes for this.
So, you are teaching a text that includes the N-word. While reading a passage of the assigned text aloud, a student reads the N-word out loud and unedited. You feel the students in class freeze. A black student loudly states, "Thanks for letting us know you're a racist." What do you do? This is pretty much how the conversation started. It's going,
Can we go back to the tools?
I was gonna say, y'all took a beat, right? You took a moment, which is exactly what we said in our response moment. So, what was the after your beat, okay, that happened, and in that, I gotta take an action. Educator supporting the students. What was the next?
So is the student, I'm sorry, is the student who is reading this non-black?
doesn't say.
Yeah, these are assumptions, I feel like, and I'm just, are you a black professor who's experiencing this, or are you supposed to, I didn't really change the dynamic. And so, I just wanted to put that out there.
Oh, the mic. Yes.
For accessibility of everyone.
Absolutely.
Take a mic, thank you.
Thank you. So we collectively decided to break for a moment and then everyone catch the breath and simmer down. And then when we came back to kind of engage the student who was offended, the black student, giving them a moment to speak further about why they made that statement, like to talk about the emotionality behind that statement more explicitly. And then perhaps bring other students in on the conversation so that it's not a spectacle. So that was kind of what we ended up with. Although we devolved, at the beginning we thought about, hey, let's prevent this from happening. Let's go back in time and
Talk about that a
Yeah,
little
what
bit.
tools would you use to prevent this?
So as someone who's taught Huckleberry Finn and African American literature, you want to provide students a space to talk about, well, one, why this text is being assigned. If it's American literature, it's Mark Twain. I don't know, yeah. But also give a heads up, like this text contains 172 uses of the word, of the N-word, and what are we gonna do collectively as a community about that? And kind of have some give and take with the class.
He also mentioned when the student is going deeper, that you're encouraging the student to use I statement.
Yes,
So
I
that's
statement.
how that made me feel,
Yes.
as opposed to you're a racist.
Yes.
Thank you for sharing. What stood out to me is the focus on your own positionality, right? Like who are you as a professor? What are the racial dynamics of the group? But also speaking about the power dynamics in the room, it's interesting that your group focused on asking the questions to the person who said, "Thanks for letting us know you're a racist," as opposed to questions that you could ask the person who read the N-word out loud, right? Which does a different thing. That situates the power in a different way. Who you interrogate or ask the questions to, or who's assumed to be doing the inappropriate thing. And there's also some pre-work that you could do around the use of that word. You could have the community conversation and say, let's decide together, or you could use that power to say, I'm going to decide that this is not a word that we will use. We're reading a book, but we're not going to say that word out loud. There's a lot of different things that you could do, but I do want to draw attention to who do you ask the questions about?
Yeah, please.
I have two questions about who do you ask the questions?
Who do you ask the questions about, and assuming who did the wrong? So I'm not sure you're saying because I asked the student who said, thanks for letting us know you're a racist, that they are in the wrong, so they need to explain themselves? Or am I saying that you need to explain to the other person? I'm sorry, I'm not matching the who's wrong and who's right. And then how you might, would you or how engage the other person, or do they get to have, I don't know quite what I'm asking. I feel like there's like one way, one person's wrong, one person's right, and one person gets to speak and one doesn't, depending on who we're calling on. And I'm not really parsing the matching who's who.
Right. So there's not necessarily a clear-cut case of who's in the wrong or who's in the right based on who you ask questions to.
Okay.
But it is a given that if I'm a faculty member in a position of power and I ask a question to someone, given their emotions or something that they did, that could put them in the hot seat, even outside of emotions. So I'm saying, let's think deeper about the power imbalance of who's in the hot seat, who do we ask questions to, and what those questions might be. So what are some examples of like a question you would ask for if you did happen to have the N-word in there and someone read that? But I guess before that, you had the mic.
Sorry, Michelle. So I've had a similar situation in my class, not with the N-word that I think you're referencing, but with the word Negro. And it's an assignment that I assigned multiple semesters, and I had a student this semester only, even after 2.5 years here, who started to read it and then paused and looked at me and said, "Professor, do I read this word aloud?" and checked in with me. So in my situation, Catherine, right? Catherine. Angela. I wanted to remember your name. I like you so much. I'm gonna get this, Angela.
Names are not, we know.
In terms of the wrong, I assumed it was me. I'm the one who was wrong. I put the reading in front of the students and forgot to remind them. I told that student to read it out loud. That's what I'm imagining, that in this situation, a student just doesn't start reading out loud. Maybe. But I imagined it was I told a student, read page 200, and I forgot, oh snap, I need to tell the students what to do about that word. So in my class, I paused and I looked at the whole room and I said, this was written in 19 such and such, this is how this, and I provided the explanation, this is how we're going to or not use this word, now move on with it. So yeah, a student was offended, but the wrong was me. I'm the teacher. I should have taught more effectively.
And I know that's where we started too, but I was thinking when she had said you asked the question was, who needs to explain themselves?
Yeah,
Like,
it's
they're
me.
And it's interesting when you said the hot seat too, because I'm like, okay, am I putting you on the hot seat or am I giving you the power to express and share in the moment? And it could be taken either way, right? Or, sorry, I'm off.
Yes,
But
I think
that's
it's-
why,
so
that's
I'm
what
just
I'm
gonna
hearing.
jump in real quick. I think it's important to acknowledge that though, because one of the things that we talked about kind of without actually naming is that our students are generally at a really critical point developmentally. When you think about the age where they're coming here with super strong ideas and then they're being challenged with those ideas or how to navigate the conversations around those ideas. So it's a little bit of both. So sometimes it can feel like you're in the hot seat, but really somebody's trying to give you power. Or you can come in with the purview of like, I have power in this situation because I'm talking about it and it's my experience.
Right.
But that's not gonna be the way that everybody comes to the conversation. So figuring out how then do we make space for both of those things while we acknowledge what the power dynamic is. And then in some instances, it's absolutely appropriate to take that power dynamic and correct the situation so that the community can have both either the restoration or can have the moment there where it feels like this is being done with care. And also you're demonstrating, you're modeling where it's like, you know what, I've made an error with the power that I have. Here's how I'm going to correct it, and then your students then see you model those things.
Great.
If I could add
Very
one little
nuanced.
thing to that nuance is around the question earlier that was asked, is this, what if it's a black student? You know, what if it's a student of color, you know, and it's not just a white student? And I think it's while we don't have enough time to delve even deeper around that, I do want us to not see this as that can't happen, because that happens too. And I don't want us to leave this particular scenario thinking, oh, only the white students could do this, so this is what I'm preparing for. Be prepared for that any student can say this word, and there's still work that you will have to do to engage, and especially that pre-work that says that I'm going to set up the parameters for how this works.
Very nuanced. For the sake of time, I want to move us to the next scene, the misgendering scene. Who has that? Okay, we got two different groups.
Read out loud, thank you.
Sure. You've been misgendering a student in class and don't notice it. Another student raises their hand in class and says to you, actually, I don't think they use they, them pronouns. What do you do?
So we agreed apologizing to the student and also reaching out to them, emailing them and saying, sorry about this, if you want to talk to me further, come to me during office hours or another time.
There's a couple more things we talked about with this. We said that this was tricky because another student said that you're misgendering a student in a class, not them. That student didn't say you were misgendering them. And so I think that that's slightly more challenging to negotiate, because it's not clear why that student might not have said it themselves, right? And so I do think obviously like apologizing, reaching out to particularly both students. But yeah, it's tricky. I mean, I have some more ideas about just like the pronouns thing too. I don't want to take too much time, but I want to say it. Which is that the thing around like pronouns is, and I've had something like this actually happen to me. I misgendered a student in one of my classes about 5 years ago, when we were kind of, I think as an institution, at least in my previous institution, kind of just coming into like the practice of asking people to disclose their pronouns. But I do think, and Hannah kind of mentioned this too, that there are some assumptions that everyone wants to disclose their pronouns. It's like, okay, now everyone tell your pronouns, but that they want to disclose them to us, or that, and I think that that's like something that we need to kind of question. It's like, why wouldn't best practice be something more along the lines of like, if this is a community, we should be able to learn each other's names. How can we avoid even using pronouns at all? It's like, why aren't you just Andrew, right? Why am I not just Christina? And I think that that's something that institutionally, because the pronoun thing is like caught fire, and I get the importance of it, but I do wonder if it is actually the best practice, because again, there may be some harm in always having people disclose their pronouns. And
assuming that that's the safest thing to do in a classroom with me and the other students, so just.
I can speak a little bit to that. So absolutely, thank you for bringing that into the room. I think there's sort of two camps of students. There are students who their comfort in the classroom is contingent upon them sharing their pronouns. And for them to be respected and seen and know their identities, to be able to bring their full selves to class, they have to share their pronouns. But for some students, I have students in my class, or come to my office every single week who are trans and are not out yet, and are saying, I'm going around the circle and I'm counting down the people towards me, and I'm stuck between a rock and a hard place of, do I misgender myself in front of the whole class, which is doing a disservice to myself, or do I out myself when I'm not ready, which is a really dangerous place to place students. So I always say, would love to go around, do names and pronouns if you'd like, and just leave it at that. And I know me as a cisgender person, as a cisgender queer person, sharing my pronouns is the best thing that I could do to model, and also to not have the only people in the room who are sharing their pronouns, folks who really want their pronouns to be heard. And then I think the pre-work is another big part of that. So sending out a survey that says, what pronouns do you want me to use in front of the class? What pronouns do you want me to use just one-on-one with you? And I'm going to shout out to Esther, who sends out the best survey in the world. Hey, claps for you. Pre-survey, definitely if people want to check that out, great resource. To ask students that, and then do you want to have a follow-up conversation about your pronouns to really give students who may sort of be stuck in a place where they're not comfortable yet that option to talk about it.
Where's the other group?
Anyone from the other group wanting to share? No pressure.
It's a pretty simple topic.
All right.
Right? Maybe one day.
The only thing I was thinking is like sort of, again, the responsibility of the instructor to name the value, right? Of sort of affirming one's gender identity, right? Sort of naming that, and then determining what is the best way to sort of really allow, to the conversation that we had, whatever's going on with the student, that we're not hyper spotlighting that student, but really affirming the sort of value of that in the moment might be a way to kind of balance that.
I really like what they did today in the other session where they talked about how they identify racially, like how they're identified. I went to a NCTE, Stanford University does a conference, and they talk about race as a verb and how people assign race to you. Like doing race is what it's called. And I felt like that was so empowering to be, I am identified as this, however, I identify as this. Because I think that's important too. You can't just look at somebody and say, oh yeah, you're black, because I'm looking at your skin color. That's very dehumanizing, and that's very, 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 that's not validating at all.
So we're going to move on to scenario number 3. So that was folks in the back. Does someone want to read?
You walk into your classroom and students are discussing the U.S. going to war. This is not the subject of your lesson for the day. One student says, it's horrible we have people going off to fight a senseless war. A second says, well, if they would have gone to college instead of the army, they wouldn't have to. The students begin to have a heated argument. What do you do? Okay, cool. So before what would we do, I think we, because this is loaded, there's a lot here, but I also, thinking back, okay, what type of class is this? Even though it's not the topic of the day, did it fit some content from previous discussions, or is it coming up in the future? We talked about, as well, we took a moment, so that pause that you all did, scenario 1, we did that collectively as well. But then there's this notion of acting and educating, because there's a lot embedded in these statements here. Even like a senseless war, where some folks in the class may think actually it's not a senseless war, right? And then this whole notion of going to college instead of the army, it's like, wait, so there's some preconceived notions in that, right? And so there is some education that has to happen. But what does that look like in real time? Because it also says there's a heated argument. So I can't even teach my content because something is happening here. And some people may choose to ignore it. So we talked about all these things. I'm trying to summarize, but you can't ignore that moment, right? Because if you ignore it, oh, we're moving on, then students aren't focusing on your content, and in addition, other students are now concerned about the moment that happened. So in the moment, we had talked about actually, and one example that we posed, if you co-construct ground rules in your classes, right, like, and you do that up front, this behavior will be outside of that, and so you're going to correct that. In this class, we agree collectively that we don't do this, right? And so getting back to the rules that we co-constructed as a group, and then really getting to the fact that, okay, so now that this is out here, let's deal with this before we can move on, and really asking those questions and inviting the discussion around this. Even though it may not be the content of the day, you can't ignore the moment that happened. Did I capture that?
Other responses, even outside of that group.
I'll say our group talked around that a lot, but one thing that we didn't talk about this, but I have since thought about it as I sat with it, is the other part to me that's interesting about this is that it happens right before the class starts. And it you can choose to read this as two students are having an argument in that weird space before the class has started, right? And I think there's a dimension of that can have me handle this differently. Because it's that question of, okay, well, do we resolve the conflict between the two students before the class starts? There's some dimension of, has the entire rest of the class witnessed this? Or do I worry about sort of the tension that formed between two students, and now if I'm going to address it to the class, then I have to have them sort of revisit and share this exchange that has happened now to maybe 20 other people that were completely unaware that this exchange had happened. And I just think that dynamic is that 5 minutes of class while I'm setting up the PowerPoint, the computer, is a weird time sometimes, because people come excited and want to talk about things, or they go in a different direction of something else. And I just think that we didn't necessarily talk about that, but I think that's an important dimension of this.
We also were talking about, because I think one of us brought up of like, what teachers business and how would this relate, and so sometimes there is a way that or events can be related to any subject, and so like while trying to figure out that community restoration of it, of like how can you tie it into your subject. So like, for example, with business, there's a lot of business in war. So why does our country go into war, war to get that money or not do that? Like to talk about that, or like in literature, what does literature talk about with war and what this stuff, and like where do we come? So like, there's a lot that we could take the scenario to lead it towards course material too. So even though it feels like, oh, this is a separate thing, it could be done also in a way to how do we restore the community by learning how to resolve arguments, but also connect it to real life, to what we're learning in the classroom.
And I think that we struggled, so we were really kind of thinking about the situation. You could tell all of us were thinking about what that actually looks like, and I think that's more helpful than not, that, you can have these tools, and we thought about, okay, what type of professor am I? What type of classroom rules have I laid out? Where's my content? And so really, you have a framework, which is very helpful, but then actually, how do you internalize that, operationalize that in your class, And so it's really good, to have these forums, and we got to have each other to be able to talk through that, because, you need that, and it's not like a one and done type of thing. You need to constantly, be going, through that. We know we're all, very smart, but we did struggle with it. That's where we are.
So I want to be respectful of everybody's time. I'm sorry, I see your hand, but I want to be respectful of everybody's time and leave with a couple thoughts. I love that you brought that in right now, that there was this collective pause, because almost every group had this pause in these moments. But these are all scenarios that we really hear in our office. Maybe tweaked a little bit, but each one of these has happened and then some. So these things happen in classes. And I also think it's fascinating that in so many of these instances, everybody said, well, what's the context? Who am I? Am I a person of color? Who read this? You are you. And you are you in every one of these moments. So So you're bringing all of that, but that's what makes this challenging, right? Because you may have a student who mirrors some of your identities or somebody who you don't understand at all, but you are still you. And you have got to figure out how it is you're gonna navigate these environments and these scenarios, these questions, these concerns that come up in your classroom. And so by all means, as you're thinking through them or thinking about some of the materials here, how do you navigate that in who you are? How do you situate yourself in each one of these moments? And what does that mean with the person that you're presenting as yourself when you are in these moments? Because that can also dictate how you might need to check some of your biases, how you need to check your power, how you need to reflect on things that you've learned from previous classes, things that you've heard from your peers. All of those are real things. So I was kind of chuckling as everybody said, well, who am I in this? You are just you, and that is enough, and that is also bringing a lot to the table that you have to navigate and figure out how to, work through the community. In everything that we talked about, one of the things that we did come back to, can you go back to the model, please? Was one that, yes, you can take that first moment where you take a moment. You can think about, who am I in this? What am I bringing? Who are the other actors in this situation? What is the context? Is it right before my class? Or has everybody sat down and this is still going? Because that also matters. When we talk about educating and support, I really appreciate, Brian, that you brought that in there because there is an educational moment. I appreciate that you talked about no matter what class. We intentionally said that this is not part of your lesson plan, but we did not say what your class was. Because there will be times, no matter what you're teaching, that there are still really relevant things that matter to your students. And when you think about your classroom as a community, no matter what you're teaching, then you have a responsibility to care for that community. Your students are coming there to learn in that community. And as educators, if you think about your interaction as an investment in your students, there's multiple angles to tackle that. And you're investing in the community with everything that you do. Okay, you could go to the end here. So we feel rushed. So I can imagine y'all feel a little rushed too. A lot of times CDI workshops take 2 to 3 hours, and it's because we really try to delve into this. So we're a little rushed today, but do want to be respectful. Want to just talk a little bit about how you can follow up with us. And there's some key ways you can do that. Certainly you can email any of us at CDI. You can email the CDI mailbox. We're happy to provide some insight and help folks as much as we can. Thank you for getting us back there.
I'm trying.
Dialogue.
Made it.
Wonderful. Join our newsletter. Please follow. That's the website there to follow the CDI newsletter. You can also go to our website. There's a link on there. By following our newsletter, you'll get key insights to the workshops and trainings that we do. They are geared primarily towards students, but we have had staff and faculty and administrators in our trainings as well, and you actually get really good insight into student perspectives and how you might navigate a little differently when you're in a room and you're the minority because it's mostly students. It's actually really cool. So highly encourage that, but also our events. We do the first Friday of every month, we do First Fridays in CDI. It is open to the whole community. And the really cool thing about First Friday is that students sometimes pop by for 10 minutes, sometimes they sit there for 3 hours and talk to us. But you get to meet them and interact with them in a way that's non-transactional, which is different for so many offices on this campus, and you just get to know them as people. And again, that helps to foster this community of care that we want to cultivate across our campus. Thank you so much. Please fill out the evaluations. We value each of you. Thank you so much.